had tea yet. I have tea
I was just sharing that I've been interested in the leaders program, so they invited me to come today. I'm very interested because this topic is so relevant to all of us, whether you're American or not. Oh yeah, I know.
What were you working?
North them down a little bit. And you want these down this way.
Yes, who's
Is that good? Higher, lower? Is that okay? Yeah.
François, ça va
A little lower?
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Yeah, there is one.
Perfect.
And the mic.
Sorry, I can. I've learned. Things I can do, I can't always do.
Is that working? Yes. Thank you all for coming. My name is Alan Chapin. I'm the chairman of the foundation. Delighted to see so many of you here. This is our second attempt to explain what's going on in the electoral process. We had a session a few days ago to talk about hacking, which you can find on our website. Obviously, everyone is more and more convinced, except for Mr. Trump himself, that the Russians interfered in our elections. I'd like to welcome the members of our executive committee, Jim Lowenstein, our founder, Al Ross, Rick Doman, François Carrel-Billiard, our deputy consul in New York has joined us. I've met him for the first time. They're so busy up there, they have no time to do anything, so it's a great honor to have him here with us. I was told to say, as we were developing this program, everyone thought that Hillary would win the election. But the truth is, I never thought Hillary was going to win the election. I always thought Trump was going to win. as Jim can attest. Anyway, this event certainly would have been different. I don't know whether it would have been as interesting if Hillary had won. But we'll hear about all of this from a distinguished panel. We all know, at least I hear from friends in Washington, that the Trump team is not exactly in touch with the State Department. We have a new approach. We'll see what it brings. And I really look forward to hearing what our panel has to say. This is exactly the kind of event that the French-American Foundation wants to do. As you know, we've been founded by Jim in 1976. There are two foundations, one in New York and one in Paris. Our mission, the mission of both, has always been to work to enrich transatlantic cooperation and understanding. And the way we do that is by having high-level events with groups like we have in front of us today. Michael Barbaro is a journalist with the New York Times who knows everything there is to know about the American political landscape, and he has covered Trump during the campaign and brought all kinds of stories about him. And recently you met him at the Times, I understand.
The infamous editorial meeting, yeah.
Yeah. Richard Fontaine is one of our distinguished young leaders. He's the president of the Center for a New American Security, a well-known nonprofit organization based in Washington. He's recently published an article in Foreign Affairs entitled "How Trump Can Save the Local Order," so he has a lot to say. And François Carrel, who serves as Associate Director of the European Institute of Columbia University, is a man of great knowledge and experience of international diplomacy. We are very happy to have all of them here today. And without any more, I will turn it over to them. They have a lot to say.
Thanks a lot, Alan, for your warm welcome, and thanks to Michael and Richard for joining us today. I guess it's never easy to predict what an incoming administration is going to implement in terms of foreign policy, and it's particularly difficult today, obviously, with a president-elect like Donald Trump, who led a very unconventional campaign, but also because of the state of the world today, which is becoming extremely unpredictable and unstable. So when you put the two together, you have a task which is going to be difficult, and we're very much looking forward to hearing what you are going to say. But you're both very well placed to enlighten us about what to expect. Michael, you've met several times with President-elect Trump. You, as Alan said, you were in the room for 1 hour with him, and you could see how the candidate is morphing into his new role. And Richard, you worked very closely with the future Secretary of Defense, General James Mattis, who is on the board of director of your think tank, so you have close proximity with an actor who's going to be a major influence in the next administration. So maybe let's start with your views. What do you think we can expect about Donald Trump's foreign policy, and we come later to the issue of what Europeans specifically should expect. But we shall be with you.
All right, thank you. Thanks to the foundation and to Alan and to Jim for having us all here. It's great to be back here. The last time we were together was on the other side of the ocean, and it was before the election, so it seems not only a continent away, but kind of an era away already. But it's great to be here today. I thought I'd say a couple of words about the presidents and Democratic presidents have disagreed with each other on almost every issue across the parties and within the parties. But really, since the end of World War II, there's been, I would submit, probably three basic fundamental principles of U.S. foreign policy. And the first is that to keep the peace, the United States should have strong alliances underwritten by the forward deployment of American troops. The second is to keep the prosperity, and to increase prosperity, we should have an open international economic system buttressed by free trade. And the third is to preserve the forces of freedom at home and abroad. The United States should support the promotion of human rights and democracy when possible, and have, when possible, a preference for democratic systems over autocracies. The interesting thing about many of the statements that candidate Trump made was that they added up to a worldview that conflicts with each of those three fundamental views. The international order in which all American presidents have been invested, created by the United States and its allies after World War II and after that, and buttressed by American power and activism around the world. Presidents have largely seen this as in American self-interest to support, because Americans are the beneficiaries. Mr. Trump has portrayed it differently, more that Americans are the victims of some of these things. And so alliances are not there just to keep the peace, but also the United States has gotten the wrong end of the stick when it comes to free-riding allies that are getting rich under our protection and paying an insufficient amount of money either to the United States or for their own defense. Trade agreements aren't about increasing prosperity per se, but rather about having the effect of killing jobs at home. And again, the Americans are not the beneficiaries, but the victims of trade agreements as they have been written thus far. And then on the issue of human rights and democracy, during the campaign at least, Mr. Trump said the U.S. doesn't have the standing to criticize human rights abuses in other countries because of the mayhem on our own streets with cops getting killed and things like that. And so you see a departure, which I don't think is part of a strategic, holistic set of foreign policies, but it is a set of instincts that were exhibited during the campaign. Now, the problem with this is, candidate Trump accurately diagnosed a lot of the problems, with the working class, unemployment, the effects of trade, some burden sharing among our alliances. But sort of scrapping the liberal order would just make those things worse, not better. And there are things that that we should do as a country, but to actively undermine things that we have been put into place would be, I think, the wrong move. And the problem is that these three principles didn't just drop from the sky in 1945, and a clerk somewhere thought they were a good idea. They were a direct response to the first half of the 20th century, where we saw the worst wars in human history, the worst depression in human history, and the rise of autocrats who thought that they could conquer the world, or at least large parts of it. And so far, it's worked, not perfectly, but better than any alternative. With that overall view, the question is, I think, how does that actually translate into policy, and how does the campaign instincts or the campaign rhetoric translate into governance? And there really is a pretty big question mark that continues to hover over what the Trump administration's foreign policy is going to be. In Jim Mattis, the future Secretary of Defense, assuming he is confirmed, you have someone who's not only anti-alliance, he's extremely pro-alliance, has worked closely with our allies around the world, was a commander of NATO's Allied Command and Transformation Unit, and certainly I don't think would believe that NATO is obsolete or some of the things that came out during the campaign. I don't know, Mr. Tillerson, Rex Tillerson has been nominated, or will be nominated as Secretary of State, but he's been a pro-free trade guy, it sounds like, from his career. And then when you overlay that on some of the moves and statements that the President-elect has made since the campaign, a phone call with Mr. Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, essentially praising NATO and saying that it was doing the right thing on terrorism, a meeting with Prime Minister Abe of Japan, who he had been pretty tough on during the campaign, saying that they were together and no talk about Japan as a free-riding ally that was taking America for a ride. Things like that. The question is how all this nets out when you have all of these things, and that is why the article that I wrote that Alan mentioned was titled "How Donald Trump Could Save the Liberal Order," not "How Donald Trump Will Save the Liberal Order" or "Will Not," which those are sort of two things I'm trying to strike from my vocabulary after the experience of the last few months, is to predict precisely what's going to happen. But what I would say is that he has built up in the course of the campaign some leverage which he could use if he determines it's in the interest of the United States to do so, to actually help establish more capable partners around the world. This has some specific consequences. So on trade, I think it's safe to say the Trans-Pacific Partnership is dead, and therefore the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, is not going anywhere anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that there's not space for bilateral deals, which the President-elect seems to favor, and what those look like, who knows. With NATO, there's been this fixation on 2% of GDP on defense spending, and this has sort of been the conversation on what countries are on the good list that are doing this, and what countries are on the bad list that are not. I think, it's possible that a guy like Jim Mattis could move to a more holistic view of the value of our allies to the United States. Actually looks like, who do we fight with? Who do we go to first? Who are reliable? What are their capabilities? Rather than just an arbitrary percentage of GDP spending. And then political relations, I think, so far, it's hard to think of a readout of a phone call that the President-elect has had with a world leader that has been anything other than positive. I mean, even President Duterte in the Philippines, who's engaged in this mass killing of drug dealers in the Philippines, he sort of praised, and told them to drop by the White House and things like that. And then this goes across the board. Theresa May, President Sisi of Egypt, all of this. I would say that for the purposes of the transatlantic relationship, and I know that we'll get to this in a few minutes, I would say I think the biggest unknown and one of the biggest drivers is going to be Russia policy. This has got everybody on both sides of the Atlantic nervous. Currently, American policy is to reject Russia's annexation of Crimea, to reject and oppose its efforts to continue to sow chaos and violence in eastern Ukraine, to establish the European Reassurance Initiative to aid in military terms NATO and strengthen NATO on its eastern flank, to keep sanctions in place together with the Europeans on Russia, and to oppose what Russia is doing together with Assad in Syria. There's a chance that all of that could change. There's also a chance that none of that could change. But the fact that it could change, and change fairly dramatically, and especially that it could be changed pursuant to a deal cut between the United States and Russia that would leave out Europe or any of our other allies, is something that has raised some nervousness on both sides. So I think that I probably tended toward putting more open-ended questions on the table than giving definitive answers, but I do think that's a sign of the times for where we are right now. But let me leave it at that for the moment.
Thanks a lot, Richard. I think you really gave us an excellent background of the situation. I'd like to go perhaps a little bit deeper with Michael about Donald Trump as a foreign policy leader. What is his vision? How would you see this? How do you see this emerging from his campaign, and also what is his method? He is going to work with other world leaders, with a team of experienced people in DC. Is he someone who listens to us?
These are great questions, and I want to thank you for having me. And I want to just start with a small caveat that I'm not a foreign policy expert. I'm a campaign and political reporter at the Times, but I've spent a lot of time with Donald Trump. I started spending time with him when I was a City Hall reporter at the New York Times, and I wanted to talk to him about golf, because that was what you did when you were a reporter in New York, covering anything. You could call Donald Trump and get him on the phone to talk about anything. And so we did. And now that he's president, that hasn't entirely changed, but we'll see how much it's changed. But we're here talking about foreign policy and the kind of foreign policy leader that a president-elect and soon-to-be President Trump will be. And the reality is that it's not all that different from the businessman and the person that Donald Trump has been. And so let me summarize everything is a negotiation. For loosely, it's an economic negotiation. So we see him talking about foreign policy through the prism of kind of economic bargaining. When we talk about NATO, the guiding principle of Article 5 is that if a NATO country is attacked, other NATO countries will come to its aid. When the Times asked Donald Trump about that during the campaign, his response was that he would first want to know if those NATO countries had fulfilled their obligations to the United States. This is new. That's not entirely how this was supposed to work. But again, it's a negotiation. Where do you stand with me, and have you participated in the economic kind of greatness of the United States? That's the first question he wants to pose in some of these situations. The other thing to think about with Donald Trump is that he tends to think of things as bilateral. Where do I stand? Where do you stand? And where will the conversation between us go? Rather than occupying a fundamentally multilateral world where there's lots of dominoes that could fall one way or another if we make a decision. Decisions and judgments are made more in isolation than they would be with kind of a globalist or internationalist who has spent their careers thinking about the ramifications of any decision. The third thing, and there's not really a delicate way to put this, he's not all that well read and versed in the world. And when you ask him about what books he's reading or where he gets his information on foreign policy, the answer is, my colleague Maggie Haberman puts it in a shorthand, the papers and TV news. And he gets his foreign policy information from newspapers and morning television and evening television. Television is an ever-present part of Donald Trump's life. It's on during interviews, when you're interviewing. I mean, I have many colleagues who have sat down for very serious interviews with Donald Trump, and during those interviews, he's talking to them, and half of his eyes also on the television in front of him watching cable news. So it's very important to him what's being said there and what it says about him, and it can influence some of his judgments and his mindset, even on issues like foreign policy. Donald Trump will tell you this. He's told his biographer this, and we obtained the tapes. He's not a great student of the past. He's most interested in the present and in the future, and has gone so far as to say to his biographer, and I think this is a pretty remarkable quote, "I don't like talking about the past. It's all about the present and the future." Again, this is a new thing for a president of the United States. We think of them as being great students of American and global history. And the last, and also maybe one of the most important things, is that when it comes to Donald Trump, foreign policy, and as with much else in life, is deeply personalized. Are you showing respect to him? Are you being nice to him? Have you been good to him? And we already start to see the way that plays out in a lot of the decisions he's making as president. And I believe you'll see it also in foreign policy. He is a foreign leader showing deference to him, being respectful to him. And again, that's a new component to the American presidency.
Someone who has been nice to him is President Putin.
You noticed that?
How do you see the relationship developing?
Richard, you're going to know the kind of global elements of that relationship better, but let's just talk for a little bit about why we think he has such a high regard for Vladimir Putin. And I think, we talk often in the New York Times about Trump and his belief system, his worldviews. It's not so much an ideology as it is an attitude. It's a set of instincts. It's kind of a sense of where he exists vis-a-vis other people. And when it comes to Vladimir Putin, I think he looks at Putin and sees the self-regard and the confidence and the swagger, and he just likes it, and he views it as strength. And you often heard him talking about Putin as a symbol of strength, whereas he saw Barack Obama with all the shades of gray that Barack Obama occupies, and all the nuance that he embraces, and he saw that as a symbol of weakness. And when you think about why he likes Vladimir Putin, I don't think it's because he has a grand understanding of Russian history and where Vladimir Putin fits into it. I just think he likes his attitude and what he embodies both kind of physically and as a head of state.
I would just add that it's the translation of those impulses into policy that's going to be the hard part. So, for example, Trump has both said simultaneously that he wants to get along with Russia. He can imagine the United States and Russia teaming up to knock the hell out of ISIS and those things are in some ways very difficult to reconcile, right? So if we are going to team up with Russia which is allied with Iran and Assad in Syria to knock the hell out of ISIS or anybody else, the result is going to be Assad, who is essentially an Iranian client, victorious in Syria. Well, if you don't like Iran, you don't want their client in Syria. But if you like Russia, you do want their client in Syria. How does that net out? So that's the translation of these sort of personalized impulses into, national security policy that I think is pretty hard.
What are going to be the red lines in making deals with Russia? How is the Republican Party, the Washington establishment going to contribute to shaping Donald Trump's initiatives? How do you see this coming? Think about Crimea, where obviously even also in Europe there are ideas about, are we going to keep sanctions forever? What can we do? How can you restore dialogue with Russia? So from what I hear is there is an appetite for developing dialogue. But Putin also likes to make deals, and he'll come with requests. And so what is the margin of maneuver for the upcoming administration?
I mean, if you stop 10 foreign policy folks in Washington, Republicans and Democrats combined, and ask them whether we should pursue an overarching grand deal with Russia, probably 9 of them would say no. You might be able to find one that says, let's give it a shot, but even that one would be doubtful about how successful that's likely to be. And the reason would be because people think that the only way to get a deal is either to compromise all the principles on which we've built our Russian policy and our Middle East and Europe policy for a long time, or to sign a deal that won't be worth the paper it's written on, and then the Russians will disappoint. I was yesterday with some folks who are close to Kremlin. The Kremlin, they're outside of the government, but they're based in Moscow, and they sort of laid out what a deal could look like, where the United States and Russia agree to disagree on Crimea. We freeze the conflict in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. We lift the sanctions, and we team up to bomb ISIS, as we call it, or civilians, as the Russians call them. Actually, they call the civilians ISIS and bomb them. But we're bombing two groups of people, but in the Russian mind, we could team up and do it all together. And then, everything's kosher, and we sort of go on from there. I think that that's a bad deal, and the Congress would not be. My former boss, John McCain, has already laid down, a marker on Russia, as have others like Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio and others. But the president's got a lot of discretion in foreign affairs. So the question is, depending on what a deal looks like, you may not need Congress to get it done.
I can just add that this cyber attack, which it sounds like you all talked about in your last session, puts President-elect Trump in an extraordinary pickle, because regardless of whether or not you think that the cyber attack was intended to get Donald Trump elected or Hillary Clinton elected, and I guess we all suspect on some level that they favored Donald Trump, it doesn't matter, because it has created such a kind of a darkness, kind of a cloud over the election itself. It doesn't matter whether it hit the scales on November 8th. And so Donald Trump becomes president, and the public begins to absorb the fact that this may be the biggest, most malicious effort to undermine our democratic electoral system since Watergate. I mean, use your historical analogy that you favor, and it is a very big deal, and Congress is just beginning to wrap its head around what it means to investigate this. And as we know from big historical events like September 11th, when Congress starts to investigate, that then opens the floodgates to the possibility of a giant commission, which could investigate this for 6 months, a year. I mean, you know how long an investigation of this could take, and it could produce some very damning revelations. And so that's the room into which President-elect Trump walks into. It walks when he wants to start talking about Russia, when he wants to do a deal with Russia. And one of Donald Trump's guiding principles in all areas is projection of strength. How how can you be perceived as a strong president when you do a deal with a country who has in some way sponsored, advocated, approved this kind of malicious attack on a democratic system? I don't know how you do that. And so he's going to have to figure that out, but it's a tremendous burden for him.
Well, one of the things you can play with is the timing. And here's the question: is it better to rush before the Commission is, producing lots of work and then create, facts on the ground, or is it better to wait? Does he have a choice?
Well, I would tell him to wait, but he might not listen. But that's because, I don't think that rushing to cut a deal with Putin before the facts are established by a commission that is looking into violations by the same person with whom we would like to cut a deal is a good idea on the face of it. But again, he could do this, right? I mean, the sanctions on Russia are put in by executive order, so he, with a stroke of a pen, could eliminate those. The Congress would be highly likely to try to pass some legislative sanctions, either to supplement or to sort of fill the void that was there with respect to the invasion of Crimea and the rest of Ukraine, and to deal with this issue of the cyber hacking and interference with our political system. But then you get to the basic politics of this, right? If Trump really wants to dig in, doesn't want any sanctions coming out of the Congress, he vetoes the bill. You got to get 2/3 of both houses to override them. And except for the legislation a few weeks ago allowing Americans to sue Saudi Arabia for 9/11, the last piece of foreign policy legislation to be vetoed by a president and overridden was 1986, the apartheid sanctions on South Africa. So that, the president got a lot of discretion in this regard.
Maybe if we move for a moment away from Europe and look at another enormous question which came from the campaign, which is the issue of international trade and the relationship with China. Again, Trump will have to deal with countries which are going to defend their interests, and he'll have to deal with the Republican Party who doesn't share his views on this issue. How do you see him doing that, and how do you, in case he does not deliver, in case there is no real change, how is he going to sell this to his voters? And maybe this projects us into the longer term. Maybe this is not a question for the upcoming month, but it could be the question in 2018.
Let me come with a really quick answer to that, which is, so let's say Donald Trump is not able to pull off a 45% tariff on Chinese imports, which is what he's suggested he might do. Then how does he counteract that? I mean, he is a grand showman, and you already see how he would begin to counteract that. He would go have a rally in a state where Carrier said it was going to shut down a factory and export jobs and claim to have saved them. I mean, that's the mechanism by which he will compensate for the fact that many of the things he proposed during the campaign are either impractical or extremely hard to do or would have dire consequences for American economic interests. He will find targeted Trumpian ways to celebrate the kind of victories that mean something to the voters who put him in office. And I think fundamentally Donald Trump's kind of presidency will be an inwardly directed kind of White House focused on the American economy. And I suspect that most of his time and effort will be focused inward, not outward. And so, unless there is an external provocation, I think, I don't want to make predictions, as you said, certitude is running very short these days, but that you can expect his focus to be here, not as much on kind of picking fights with even foreign adversaries or allies.
Yeah, just quickly on China. I mean, the gap between where at least Capitol Hill Republicans and Democrats are and the president-elect on China is a lot narrower than it is on Russia. Russia is pretty stark. But on China, the focus is different. So, as you said, the focus of Donald Trump during the campaign on China had been economic. They've stolen our jobs. I'm going to go get them back. How are we going to get them back? We're going to slap tariffs. We're going to kill TPP, which is going to take more of our jobs, these kinds of things like that. And, I think folks on Capitol want China, but not primarily for economic reasons, primarily for geopolitical, strategic reasons, because of China's island building in the South China Sea and threat to freedom of navigation, because of the pressure it's been putting our allies across East and Southeast Asia, because of its insufficient cooperation in trying to restrain the North Korean nuclear program, because of the sort of footsie it's played with Russia and things. You can imagine translating some of these instincts again into something that I think would be very hard, if not impossible, to pull off, but closer to Russia as a way to constrain China, the sort of flip of the Kissinger, Nixon, plan. But we'll see. Thus far, like I said, the focus has been almost exclusively on the economic side and not on these other things. But the sentiment that China should not have a free hand to exert its will if that will is going to conflict in fundamental ways with either American national interests or with the regional order in Asia, that is more broadly shared.
The question, maybe we're going to soon open the floor for questions for our participants, and but before we do that, I have two more questions, one on the Middle East and the other one on Europe. The Middle East, I was stricken by the confidence that the president-elect conveyed when discussing the issue in the boardroom of the New York Times, and with you can see also a little bit of the kind of the personal challenge that it takes with it, saying it's possible to make peace. No one has done it before, so I can do it. Right. And so I'd like to see how you see this coming, how you see this interaction between personal dream in some way, ambition, and the reality on the ground. And my other question would be about Europe. For all we know, it seems the closest relationship with any European politician that Donald Trump has is with Farage, the leader of Brexit. Does he see Europe as a partner, or is he perhaps a bit more ideological regarding Europe than with the other region of the world? And does he think that there is a possibility to build a kind of coalition of populists and create something new? So those two regions, how do you see him, and how do you see his team taking positions? Maybe we could start with Richard.
Sure. On the Middle East peace process, it would be a very bad idea for him to take that on, not because Middle East peace is an unworthy objective. It is very worthy. It's because the chances of achieving it are approximately zero. And we saw in the second Obama term when John Kerry spent about a year and a half almost exclusively focused on trying to bring about a Middle East peace agreement, the opportunity cost when the rest of the world is also looking for American time, attention, and energy. I mean, to get a Middle East peace agreement now, you would have to imagine that either Mahmoud Abbas would get and accept a better deal from Benjamin Netanyahu than that which he rejected from Ehud Olmert, or that Netanyahu would accept a lesser deal from Abbas than Olmert was willing to accept from Abbas. And I don't know how you get there. And so that's just the basic parameters of that. And again, I've been surprised by a whole lot this year, so maybe Donald Trump is the key to unlocking the Middle East peace process. But I doubt it, and I would be worried about a misallocation of diplomatic resources at a minimum. On Europe, I think it's hard to imagine sort of, a populist international, like, the Popular Turn or something like this, where, Farage and Le Pen and the Dutch and the Hungarians and the Poles, they all sort of get together with Trump and they have some sort of common agenda to drive out, I don't know what, the elites, the center right, the center left. You can probably answer this question better than me. Trump doesn't seem to, want to build a team like that rather than sort of do his own thing. But also it's hard for me to imagine, other than maybe opposition to illegal immigration at home, what would really unite these guys in common effort? I mean, they may have some similar grudges, but what would the agenda look like? So, you know, maybe the Farage bit can be explained by the fact that that was the one foreign politician who was willing to come over to the United States and say nice things and do rallies with candidate Trump. President Trump is going to have friends all over the world. President of the United States.
Right. When Trump came to the New York Times, we asked him about a conversation he had with Farage about wind power. You guys, do you know the story? This is also kind of an interesting window into Donald Trump. When he had an opportunity to spend time with this leader of the Brexit movement, one of the things that came up in the meeting was Donald Trump's preference that windmills not be built near his golf course in the UK. Again, I always like to just put this simply, this is a new phenomenon when it comes to President-elect Trump. I'm pretty fascinated. I mean, this is a group of people thinking about Europe in a big and thoughtful way. And I know that in Europe and among people who spend time going back and forth between the United States and Europe, there's a fascination, and maybe the right word is some dread and anxiety about Donald Trump. And for the longest time, it's my sense that the European countries like France and like Britain, you know, look across the ocean to the United States and they see themselves reflected back in the mirror, their values, what's important to them, their identity. But in a way, Europe didn't really need Trump's election to have an identity crisis. It's going through a really interesting identity crisis all on its own, with Syrian refugees, with Brexit, with the rise of these populist right-wing movements and the leaders that represent them looking to have very strong chances in upcoming elections. And so I find that almost as fascinating as what's going on here in the United States. And I think it's natural that Trump will find common cause with those populist leaders, if for no other reason than the fact that his whole life he's viewed himself as an outsider. And if you just look across the river to Queens, that's where Donald Trump grew up. And his biography, even though he's always been wealthy and privileged and a member of the elite, is one of a person who saw himself as an outsider, looking in at the elites and knowing he wasn't ever going to be a member of their club on some level. And that's why he was such an effective populist. And I think he identifies with those who look at a system and establishment and find it to be flawed and want to upend it somehow. And that's why I think he will have a relationship with the problems of the world, more than any kind of common ideology or intellectual kind of engagement. Does that feel right to you?
Yeah, it's just hard for me to see what that actually
Does in terms of policy.
Yeah, I mean, how does that manifest itself other than, you know, attaboys?
Yeah, I mean, but the expressions of sympathy are pretty important for the President of the United States. I mean, if he gets behind the candidacy of some of these folks, that will be really fascinating. And that's something that U.S. presidents don't normally do, but I think it's the kind of role that Donald Trump would bend without a whole lot of thought, would just get behind and excited about someone running for the highest office in another country. In the same way that those leaders kind of did that subtly with him.
Well, there is one big question: is whether his victory, was a show that populist parties could, win power in liberal democracies, and some of them obviously felt a boost after the November election in the U.S. without the president-elect having to give any signal of preference or the other. It's a kind of natural. In some way, he has created a new way of doing politics, of communicating with the voters, and again, I'd like to open the floor and ask our participants to perhaps ask questions. But how do you see, Michael? Do you see this continuing? Is he continuing to express his thoughts on Twitter? Is he going to have this very special direct relationship with followers?
Yeah, and bypassing the news media. Just this morning, Donald Trump, most likely watching television, got on Twitter and sent out 4 or 5 messages. The first one was making fun of the editor of Vanity Fair, Dylan Lee Grady Carter, who was a favorite target of Donald Trump, saying he should lose his job. And we think it was because Vanity Fair has just written a very, very scathing review of the Trump Grill, which is a very expensive restaurant inside Trump Tower. And then he went on to challenge the media for reporting about the Russian hacking and wondering why it was Barack Obama hadn't spoken out against it more forcefully before the election. So, you know, we have a president-elect and future president who, in reaction to his emotions and what he's feeling at any given moment when he's consuming largely media, will go on Twitter and communicate directly to the world. And I think sometimes we overthink what that means. I don't think it's part of a grand strategy to communicate directly to the voters. I think it's sometimes simply the human reaction of this person to anything in his life. And he knows that it does connect him in a kind of visceral way to the public and kind of instigates this kind of amplifying force to his message. But I think sometimes we ascribe too much motive to what he's doing, and ultimately it's just a guy going on Twitter and inventing this thing.
Richard, is this compatible with the world of diplomacy, which requires some protection of secrecy at times? But does this secrecy still exist with WikiLeaks, with a number of things which are much more out in the open?